This is the second part of the recording dealing with legislation, and I just wanted to show you a couple of other things with respect to both federal and then state legislation, specifically Queensland legislation. This is the Federal Register of Legislation we looked at previously. It's at legislation.gov.au. A couple of interesting things, but before we get into the acts themselves, have a look at this tab here on information, and particularly because we're doing statutory interpretation, have a look at this one down here about legislation, how to read legislation, structures of law and structural elements in a typical act. That's pretty interesting. Just click on that section. There's the usual structure, so chapters, parts, divisions, subdivisions, etc. So I thought you might find that interesting. The structures of laws generally, if I click on that link, a little bit more information about the way acts are identified, usually by a short title or by its series, year and number, and then some more information about how they're generally laid out. Go back to the beginning though. This is where we'll find the acts up here, the acts in force. So if I click on that link, it takes us through to this table here. Now, I have had a look previously on another site because I'm interested in border force. I know that, in fact, that if I look for it directly, it would be here under AU because it's called the Australian Border Force legislation. But if I search by title over here and I just put in Border Force and apply that, here's the only legislation with those words, and sure enough, the Australian Border Force Act. If I have a look at the series, which we'll need to do for a purpose in a minute, relatively new legislation which was only passed in 2015. These are all versions which are now superseded. Here's the latest version of the Act. If I click on that, it would take me through to it. But what I'm interested in for today's purposes is the fact that it was passed in July 2015. That was when, its start date was the 1st of July 2015. And then this version expired the following year because clearly you can see from up here that it was superseded. So I'm looking for the bill from 2015. Now, I leave the Federal Register of Legislation because I've found the piece of legislation I'm interested in. I might just click on it though, just take us through for a quick look. Yes, there it is. That's the one that I'm interested in. Mind you, note that it's telling me that it is superseded, so probably what I should have done was click this one, the latest version. There we are. So it's in force, it's got a tick on it, it's in force, this is the latest version, and I can download a copy if I wish, but for our current purposes, let's just have a look. Let's jump over now to the Australian Parliament website, because what I want to do now is see if I can find the bill from when this was introduced in 2015. So if I go to the APH website, so it's aph.gov.au, this is the website for the Australian government. There's some quick links down here, but what I'm looking for is the bills in the House. Now, remember that the main perspective of this page is for people who are looking for bills currently before the House of Representatives. This is, after all, where new bills are being debated and discussed and what have you. So a couple of little tricks when we're looking for a historical version. Now we know that we're looking for something with border force. Let's just try our luck again. The only thing that I'll say to you that we need to do though is we do need to look at more options. So for a start, we're not actually looking at the current Parliament, are we? So we need to change that. And I'll go to date range here, none, okay. And now the other thing is down here, it's not currently before the Senate, it's not passed before both houses just yet. What we're looking at is it's a previous bill and it has already received the royal assent. So this is the stuff where it's currently moving its way through the chamber. For previous bills, these are the tags that we need to hit. So a previous bill, it's already received royal assent, date range. If we knew which parliament it was introduced in, I guess we could go over here, but I'm not sure of which Parliament it was. I could take a guess, but probably best we just say, for now, no date range. And look, the only other one we could check is that one, because it was certainly a bill that was introduced by the government. Let's see if we have any luck. Okay, well there's a couple of the bills that are of interest to us, and this is the one here, the Australian Border Force Bill. Have a look at this, introduced with Customs and Other Legislation Amendment Bill. This bill establishes the statutory office and the role of the Australian Border Force. But what we're really interested in is, remember, we're looking at in the in-force legislation. So remember, we're looking at this piece of legislation, the Australian Border Force Act. There it is currently, as it is currently enacted, in force. We'll jump back to our search. Here it was historically when it was introduced, so a bit of information about when it went in, February 2015, into the House of Reps. The status, it's now is an act. Whose portfolio is it in? Immigration and Border Protection. But most importantly, this is what we're looking for. There's a copy of the bill that was presented, and this one here is the explanatory memo. And we're going to use these explanatory memos later on when you're doing some statutory interpretation using extrinsic material that's outside of the Act. And so here's that explanatory memo, and if we just go to the first few lines, you can see what it's all about. The purpose of the bill: to establish the role of the Australian Border Force Commission, to enable the operation of the Australian Border Force, and introduce provisions to support the management of a professional and disciplined workforce that exerts its powers and functions with the highest standards of integrity, etc. So then it goes on in a lot more detail about the legislation, how it's going to work. You probably saw reference in your textbook to the fact that now needs to have a statement of compatibility with human rights and so on. So there's the information about the legislation so far as the explanatory memo is concerned. So that's the bill. That's how we find it. We have to go to the Parliament as opposed to finding it on the official website. And remember, the other thing about this register here, the Federal Register of Legislation, was that this was the official site of Australian government legislation. If you're using this in court, this is where you need to get your copy of the Act from.